Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
Thanks for having me back.
So I want you, the listener, to just imagine something for a second. Imagine stepping out of the cold, damp air of a Victorian London winter.
It is already pretty miserable.
Oh, completely. But you push open this creaking door of a really dilapidated boarding house, and you climb all the way up to a freezing attic.
Right.
You walk in and you find a woman, and she's completely abandoned by society, literally slowly starving to death, huddled for warmth alongside 9 stray cats.
Yeah, the story of Granny Evans.
Yeah.
It's a heartbreaking image.
It really is. And the crazy thing is that isn't a scene from some Charles Dickens novel, you know? It's not Fagin or Bill Sykes.
No, not at all.
That was just a recorded Tuesday afternoon for the vanguard of the London City Mission in the 19th century.
Which is a reality that I think perfectly shatters that glossy, sort of sanitized version of Victorian London that we usually hold in our heads.
Right, because we tend to picture, the British Empire at its absolute peak.
Exactly. We picture the wealth, the palaces, pristine carriages rolling down these nice cobbled streets.
Top hats and fancy dresses.
Yeah, all of that. But the reality for the massive urban underclass was just fundamentally muddy, dangerous, and incredibly desperate.
So that's what we are taking a deep dive into today. We are looking at a remarkably resilient piece of history extracted from the book streets paved with gold, the story of the London City Mission by Irene Howat and John Nicholls.
It's a fascinating book.
It really is. And the core mission for our discussion today, for this deep dive, is unpacking a genuine mystery of longevity.
Right, the survival aspect.
Exactly. I mean, how does an organization that was founded in the literal muck of 1835 survive the rise and fall of the British Empire?
And outlast 2 world wars.
Right. 2 world wars, the invention of the internet, massive cultural shifts, and yet they still remain a vital force on the streets of London today. It's wild.
It really is. And, the author of the book's foreword, Tim Keller, he argues that the answer actually lies entirely in their methodology.
Okay, break that down for me. What was the methodology?
Well, the London City Mission, or the LCM as we'll probably call them, they were operating a century ahead of their time.
A full century?
Yeah, easily. I mean, long before modern sociology gave us terms like urban mission or systemic poverty mapping, this organization had stubbornly planted itself among the poor.
Right, the immigrants, the marginalized.
Exactly. And they just refused to retreat to the comfortable suburbs. They stayed right there.
Okay, so I want to look at the catalyst for all of this. Because to understand how they survived so long, I feel like we have to look at the literal disease that forced their creation in the first place.
Oh, yeah. The physical reality of the city.
Right. We need to talk about the 1849 cholera epidemic because, from what the book describes, it wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a full-blown apocalyptic panic.
It truly was apocalyptic. I mean, Asiatic cholera was still relatively new to Europe at the time.
And they didn't really know what it was, right?
Exactly. The medical establishment didn't understand germ theory yet. They literally believed diseases were spread by miasma.
Miasma, which is what? Just bad air?
Yeah, bad air or foul smells coming from the slums. Mm-hmm. And the symptoms of cholera itself are uniquely terrifying.
Because it's so fast.
Unbelievably fast.
Huh.
A perfectly healthy person could wake up in the morning, suffer massive, violent fluid loss, turn a deep shade of blue.
Wow, blue.
Literally blue.
Yeah.
And they could be dead by nightfall.
That is horrifying.
It is. And in the late summer of 1849, this particularly virulent strain hit London. And in one single month, 10,000 Londoners died.
10,000 people in 4 weeks.
Yeah.
I mean, the infrastructure of the city must have just completely buckled under that.
It did. And the really tragic part is that the death toll wasn't distributed evenly across the city.
It hit the poor harder.
Much harder. It basically hunted in the slums.
Yeah.
The book actually highlights one incredibly concentrated area where 81 adults and dozens of children died practically overnight.
This wiped out.
Completely. There's this first-hand account in the text of a family of 7 living on a single street. The father, a 14-year-old boy, and a 16-year-old daughter all died and were buried together on the same day.
Oh, my gosh.
And then, a day later, the mother and the older son were dead too.
So entire family lineages were just erased in 48 hours.
Erased.
Just gone. Which, honestly, that brings a completely different weight to a primary document the authors highlight in the book. Because in 1849, The Times published a letter, right?
Yes, a very famous letter.
Signed by 54 Londoners from these forgotten districts. And when you read the phonetic spelling in the text, because they spelled things exactly how they sounded, you can just hear the absolute desperation.
It's the voice of a population that knows it has been left to die.
Exactly. They wrote, and I'll just quote a bit of it here, "May we beg and beseech your protection and power. We are, sir, as it may be, living in a wilderness, so far as the rest of London know anything of us."
That phrase, living in a wilderness.
Yeah, and it goes on. "We live in muck and filth. We ain't got no privé, no dustbins, no drains, no water supplies, and no drain or sewer in the whole place. The stench of the belly hole is disgusting. We all of us suffer, and numbers are ill, and if the cholera comes, Lord help us."
If the cholera comes, Lord help us, it gives you chills.
It really does.
And that phrase you mentioned, living in a wilderness so far as the rest of London know anything of us, that is really the defining psychological reality of the 19th century urban poor.
Because they were just invisible to the wealthy.
Completely invisible. London was expanding so rapidly due to the Industrial Revolution that the physical infrastructure, the water, the sewage, the housing, it was all just collapsing.
Right.
And this created what the book brilliantly terms a spiritual cholera to match the physical one.
Spiritual cholera.
Yeah. And this exact void, this desperation, is what David Naismith stepped into.
Okay, let's examine Naismith, because he's the guy who drafts the Constitution for the London City Mission in 1835.
That's right.
Now, he isn't just pulling this idea out of thin air, is he?
No, not at all. He was actually looking at a model from a man named Thomas Chalmers up in Glasgow, Scotland.
Okay.
Chalmers had been pioneering this kind of urban ministry about 20 years earlier. And Chalmers was a brilliant thinker. He built this whole system that integrated intense spiritual visitation with actual poverty relief.
Like handing out funds and food.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Naismith, he looked at this sprawling, chaotic beast of a city that was London. And he realized that Chalmers' exact blueprint just wouldn't survive there. London was too big, too messy.
So what did he do?
He made two foundational changes to the model. First, he made the mission completely interdenominational.
Meaning no specific church affiliation?
Right. No Baptists versus Anglicans versus Methodists. The crisis was so staggering that arguing over church governance or theology was a luxury Christians could no longer afford.
Okay, yeah, that makes total sense. It's basically an all-hands-on-deck approach.
Exactly. But the second change he made, this is the truly radical one. Chalmers had deeply intertwined his mission work with the official poor law relief.
Which was the state-sponsored financial aid system, right?
Right. But Naismith explicitly banned his missionaries from dispensing official state poor relief. He entirely divorced the spiritual visitation from the financial almsgiving of the state.
Okay, hold on. I have to push back on this. Because I am genuinely confused by that strategy.
Sounds counterintuitive.
Very. I mean, if I'm looking at Naismith, I see a guy who is trying to scale an organization, right? And he essentially decides to cut off his strongest asset, government funding.
Right.
You are sending missionaries into homes where people are, like the woman with the cats we talked about, literally starving to death.
Right.
If you deliberately separate your spiritual care from bringing official financial relief to these people, aren't you just guaranteeing that your missionaries are going to be seen as incredibly cold or irrelevant or just totally out of touch with reality?
It completely looks like a terrible strategy on paper. It really does. Until you understand the brutal mechanics of the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act.
Okay, explain that.
The state relief system in Victorian England was not some compassionate modern welfare program. Not at all. It was built on a very harsh utilitarian philosophy called less eligibility.
Less eligibility? What does that mean in practice?
It meant the government intentionally designed the workhouses and the poor relief to be so miserable, so degrading, and so harsh that only those on the absolute brink of starvation would ever accept it.
Wait, so the state's actual logic was, if we make charity comfortable, people will just get lazy.
Precisely. That was the literal policy. To get state help, you often had to enter a workhouse.
Which were awful places.
Horrendous.
Rough.
Families were separated upon entry, husbands from wives, children from parents. The labor was back-breaking, mindless stuff like unpicking old ropes, and the food was barely sustaining.
Oh, wow.
So think about it from Naismith's perspective. If the London City Mission acted as the distributors or agents of that specific system, they would instantly be viewed by the poor and government bureaucrats.
They would be seen as agents of an oppressive state. Okay, that changes everything. Because if you come in handing out government money, The relationship becomes entirely transactional.
Right.
And defensive.
Yes.
Like people would just lie to the missionaries to get the cash, or they would hate them for all the miserable strings attached to it.
You nailed it. By severing that tie to the poor law, Naismith forced a completely different dynamic. The missionaries had zero state power. They had no government cash to hand out.
So what did they have?
The only thing they had to offer was genuine, sustained human presence.
Just showing up.
Just showing up. Furthermore, Naismith's constitution demanded that these be paid full-time workers.
Oh, interesting. So not volunteers.
Right. This wasn't a weekend hobby for wealthy aristocrats looking to feel good about themselves. This required a vanguard of dedicated professionals who were walking the slums day in and day out.
Okay, so let's take that theoretical blueprint, that separation from state funds, and let's test it against the actual streets.
Let's do it.
Because the book calls this the daily round, right?
Yes, the daily round.
And turning down government funding is a very noble idea in a boardroom, but how does a missionary actually function when they encounter the Granny Evans scenario?
Right.
I mean, you open the door, she has no food, she has no fire, she has 9 cats, and she's freezing to death. What do you do if you can't give her state funds?
Well, it's important to note the missionaries weren't forbidden from personal compassion.
Okay.
When the missionary actually found Granny Evans, he was horrified. The text notes that he immediately went out and bought her warm milk and food out of his own pocket.
Oh, his own pocket.
Or they would use private, entirely unregulated donations. They always addressed the immediate physical trauma, but they didn't do it as an arm of the state bureaucracy.
Got it. And that grassroots, immediate human compassion really stands in stark, brutal contrast to how the government was handling the exact same poverty.
Very stark.
Like, let's look at the Banner Street Asylum for the houseless poor.
Oh, yes. The Banner Street Asylum.
The book includes this 1884 report from a missionary who visited this place. And honestly, it reads like a dystopian nightmare.
It really does. The Banner Street Asylum was the ultimate embodiment of that Victorian less eligibility mindset we just talked about.
Just bureaucratic coldness.
Complete coldness. When destitute people arrived seeking shelter from the freezing streets, they were sorted. They were issued either a green ticket or a white ticket.
Like green and white tickets, what does that mean?
Yeah, so a white ticket was for first-timers. And that granted you the privilege, and I use that word loosely, of sleeping there for 7 nights.
7 nights. Okay. And then what?
Once those 7 nights were up, you were strictly barred from returning for 14 days.
14 days, even if it was freezing outside.
Regardless of the weather outside, you were just back on the street.
That is incredibly harsh.
And the food ration is what really gets me.
Yeah, talk about the food.
As these exhausted, freezing people shuffled into the dormitories, each person was handed exactly 1/8 of a loaf of bread.
1/8 of a loaf.
That was their entire caloric intake for the night. Even the missionary who was observing this, he wrote in his report that it felt like a very cold and cheerless kind of charity.
I mean, I'm just picturing the government officials sitting in an office somewhere, terrified of offering an inducement to laziness, right?
Exactly.
So they just mathematically calculated the absolute bare minimum amount of bread a human needed to survive until morning.
Exactly. But here is where Naismith's strategy, severing from the state, really pays off on a macro level.
How so?
Because these LCM missionaries were walking the floors of the Banner Street Asylum, and they were crawling up into the attics with Granny Evans. They were gaining an intimate, granular knowledge of the slums that the politicians in Westminster completely, utterly lacked.
Because the politicians never went there.
Never. So the missionaries essentially became the eyes, the ears, and eventually the conscience of social reform in London.
Right. Because they didn't just preach to the poor, they actually dragged the powerful down into the muck to see it for themselves.
Yes, they did.
The text details this specific instance where 3 LCM missionaries, their names were Miller, Walker, and Jackson, they take Lord Shaftesbury on a tour, right?
Lord Shaftesbury, yes. A very prominent politician and social reformer. They took him on a literal physical tour of the common lodging houses.
And you just have to imagine the sensory assault of a Victorian lodging house.
Ooh, it would be overwhelming.
We're talking about dilapidated buildings crammed with 50,000 transient people every single night across the city.
And over a quarter of them were under 15 years old.
Just kids. And the smell, unwashed bodies, raw sewage, sickness, damp coal smoke, it was suffocating.
And Shaftesbury was a wealthy aristocrat. He lived in a completely different world.
Right.
Seeing and smelling this firsthand, it just shattered him.
And the book notes that Shaftesbury was so deeply provoked by what these three missionaries showed him that he unleashed an absolute political firestorm.
He really did.
He forced new, sweeping health and safety legislation through Parliament. I mean, for the first time ever, these lodging houses were placed under strict police inspection.
Which was revolutionary.
Buildings had maximum occupancy limits based on actual square footage. Men and women were finally separated to prevent the rampant abuse that was occurring.
Exactly. Tens of thousands of lives were tangibly improved, not just because the missionaries preached, but because they mapped the suffering and exposed it to power.
That is incredible.
It is. And, decades later, in 1902, the famous social researcher Charles Booth, he conducted this massive sociological assessment of London.
The poverty maps, right.
Yes, the famous poverty maps. He looked at the LCM, and he concluded that they occupied a social space that was entirely unique in the city.
Because they were trusted.
Because they stayed on the same beat for years. And because they weren't handing out official government cash, they circumvented the natural suspicion of the poor. Booth actually compared them to a medieval saint or a father confessor at once and friend.
A father confessor and friend. That's a high compliment.
Very high.
But, I'm trying to put myself in the boots of a brand new missionary. Say it's 1885.
Okay, 1885.
You are standing outside this sprawling, multi-story lodging house in Whitechapel. It's packed with exhausted, suspicious, desperate people.
Yep.
You don't have government authority. You don't have a giant sack of cash to hand out. How do you even begin? I mean, you can't just kick the door off its hinges and start shouting theology at a room full of tired dock workers.
No, you would be thrown out a window immediately.
Literally.
Earning trust in those specific environments required a psychological toolkit that was incredibly sophisticated for its time.
What did that look like?
It required a profound lowering of status. They had to practice what we might call a quiet radicalism.
Quiet radicalism. Let's start with how they approached probably the most heavily stigmatized group in Victorian society. Women working in prostitution, or, fallen women, as the era called them.
Right.
Because the moralism of the 19th century was just suffocating. If a woman was pushed into street work, society essentially considered her biologically and morally ruined forever.
They were completely written off.
And the Contagious Diseases Act actually criminalized them while completely ignoring the men who bought their services.
Typical of the era, unfortunately. Yet, the LCM missionaries displayed this astonishing lack of Victorian judgment.
Tell me about the 1849 report.
Yeah, the 1849 annual report documents this 13-year-old girl who was forced onto the streets.
Yeah.
And things were so bad that even her widowed mother had entirely given up on her after she had several relapses.
Even her own mother.
Even her mother. But it was an LCM missionary who actively tracked this young girl down. He built a relationship with her with absolutely zero judgment. He reconciled her with her mother. He secured her a safe place in a refuge. And he actually helped her find stable employment.
Just rolling up his sleeves and doing the work. And missionary Thomas Jackson, he reported that in one single year, 227 of these women visited him at his own private home, asking for help to escape the streets.
At his own home. That shows an immense level of trust.
It really does. And by 1859, the LCM was operating these things called midnight meetings.
I love this concept.
It's so practical. They offered hot tea, a safe environment, a Christian message, and crucially immediate, no questions asked admission to a refuge for anyone who wanted an out.
No questions asked. That was huge. Now, to truly appreciate the nuance of this LCM approach, it's highly instructive to contrast it with another famous group that actually emerged from the exact same London ecosystem.
You're talking about William Booth's Salvation Army.
Yes, the Salvation Army.
They were doing similar work, but their methodology was like the polar opposite. I kind of think of it like the difference between a high-altitude bomber and a specialized ground infiltration unit.
That's a very apt analogy. The historian Pamela J. Walker points out that the Salvation Army operated primarily on confrontation.
Right.
They fully expected to rouse the devil and infuriate sinners. They marched right into the worst slums with full brass bands, uniforms, and very loud open-air preaching.
Which is a massive disruption to the local ecosystem.
Huge disruption.
And the local ecosystem fought back violently.
Yes, it did.
I mean, the public confrontation triggered actual street riots. Local gangs of young men formed these groups that they literally called skeleton armies.
The skeleton armies.
And they would actively hunt down the Salvation Army parades. They would mock them, they would throw dead rats at them, and they would physically beat the Salvationists in the streets.
It was incredibly dangerous. Meanwhile, you look at the LCM, and they explicitly instructed their workers to go quietly among the people and to avoid arousing a commotion.
Going quietly.
Yeah. They weren't looking to win a dramatic street battle. They were looking to win the long game of trust.
Right. There is a quote in the book from an LCM missionary named John Davis in 1894 that I think is basically the Rosetta Stone for their entire methodology.
Well, the natural man quote.
Yes. He was reflecting on his early failures as a missionary, and he wrote, "Some years ago I made an awful mistake. I tried to be a parson."
Meaning he tried to leverage the formal authority of the church. He was preaching top down.
Exactly. He realized that pulling rank just didn't work. It alienated people, so he changed his entire operating system. He said, "I have had enough of that. I will just be a natural man in a natural way. I will go and speak to the people in the most simple way I can and talk to them in their own language."
The natural man strategy. It's just brilliant psychology.
It really is.
By stripping away all that ecclesiastical language and the formal posturing, Davis basically disarmed the natural defenses of the working class. He approached them not as a superior, but as a conversational equal.
And they needed every single ounce of that conversational agility because the streets of late 19th century London were an absolute political powder keg.
They absolutely were. And it's important to frame this next part carefully for you, the listener.
Right, let's set the parameters here.
We are looking at primary historical documents from the book that detail encounters with 19th century left-wing socialist and communist groups.
Yes.
As we go through these stories, our goal here isn't to take a political stance on those historical labor movements or on the capitalists they opposed. We are taking absolutely no sides. We are strictly looking objectively at the documented history of how these missionaries navigated a highly radicalized, angry working class without getting torn apart.
Exactly, just reporting the history as documented. Because the atmosphere at that time was incredibly tense. You had the 1887 occupation of Trafalgar Square by demonstrators, which ended in troops violently clearing the crowds on what became known as Bloody Sunday.
Right.
And then the 1890s saw widespread, devastating strikes. And the missionaries were out there in the open air, right in the crossfire of all of this.
They were right in the thick of it.
The book details this really intense exchange during an 1895 strike in Bethnal Green. A crowd of furious, striking workers cornered a missionary and threw a very sharp, very pointed theological challenge right at him.
They were testing him.
Big time. They essentially said, "Doesn't your Bible say, 'Do unto others'? Why don't you go preach that to the wealthy capitalists so they share their massive profits with us?"
Which, honestly, is a brilliant, entirely valid question from a crowd that has been pushed to the brink of starvation by industrial capitalism.
Totally valid. So the missionary stood his ground and argued back that profit-sharing models had been tried and had failed. But then he made a massive tactical error.
He abandoned the strategy.
He totally abandoned the natural man approach. He slipped right back into being a moralistic parson.
Oh.
He started lecturing these starving, striking workers about their drinking habits. He literally pointed at a couple in the crowd who were boozing on Saturday night.
Oh, no. And he lost the crowd instantly, didn't he?
Completely. The text says they just jeered at him, yelling, Who, the old cry, you nasty, drunken working men."
Wow.
They were so exhausted by the wealthy elite telling them that their systemic poverty was entirely their own fault because they like to have a pint of beer.
It's a perfect example of how fragile trust was in that environment. One moralistic lecture, and the bridge is burned.
Yep.
But the text contrasts that failure with how other missionaries adapted to the exact same political hostility. Another missionary working in that same radically socialist area took a completely different approach.
What did he do?
He started attending the local socialist meetings.
Wait, to debate them? To stand up and tell them they were wrong?
No, not at all. For several weeks, he never even opened his mouth.
Really?
He just sat quietly in the back of the room and listened. He documented their speeches. He sought to genuinely understand the mechanics of their economic grievances before he ever presumed to offer them a spiritual solution.
That is amazing. Listening as a tool to disarm hostility.
Exactly.
And that takes us to one of the most fascinating stories in the entire book, which involves a young Welsh communist.
Oh, this is a great story.
Hey.
The book outlines this young man from Wales who had moved to London and was deeply, deeply entrenched in communist ideology.
Right.
He viewed Christianity exactly as Karl Marx did, as the opiate of the masses, essentially a brake on the wheels of progress. He was so committed to the cause that he was actively organizing a trip to Moscow to join his comrades of the Third International.
But then, through some random family connection, he ends up boarding in the private home of an LCM missionary.
Which sounds like a sitcom setup, right? You would expect a massive clash of titans every night over dinner.
Oh, for sure.
But the young man later recalled that the missionary completely disarmed him. The missionary didn't yell. He didn't confiscate the kid's literature. He was simply patient and courteous.
Patient and courteous.
Yeah. Whenever the young man wanted to argue politics, the missionary would quietly, relentlessly hold his ground, offering a vision of human betterment through spiritual transformation.
So it was just this sheer attrition of kindness that wore him down.
Exactly. The young communist eventually went through this massive ideological and spiritual crisis. It culminated in what he later called a drunken bout that he viewed as the devil's last kick. Following that crisis, he entirely abandoned his trip to Moscow, and he converted to Christianity.
That is wild.
And that entire paradigm shift happened not through some guy with a megaphone yelling in the street, but just over a breakfast table with someone who was relentlessly courteous.
Just sitting across from the natural man.
Right.
But, even as the LCM mastered the art of the boarding house and the breakfast table, a really glaring strategic blind spot was emerging for them because the geography of the city was changing right beneath their feet.
It was changing rapidly.
By the 1840s, the mission looked at their data and realized that knocking on doors during the day meant they were overwhelmingly only speaking to women and children.
Because the Industrial Revolution had literally sucked the men out of the neighborhood.
Exactly. The demographic shift was massive. The men were gone all day. So to reach the working class man, the mission had to physically map itself directly onto the new industrial arteries of the British Empire.
So in 1843, which is just 8 years after Naismith founded the organization, they expanded beyond home visitation into workplace missions.
Going where the men are.
Going where the men are. They sent men into the massive London docks, the sprawling canal networks, the omnibus depots, and the cab ranks.
Well, we have to be super clear about the environment they were stepping into. Victorian industry was basically a meat grinder.
Oh, absolutely.
There was no occupational safety and health administration. There were no human resources departments to file a grievance with. The work was brutal, the machinery was unforgiving, and the mortality rate was incredibly high.
The book uses a really gruesome incident from 1887 to illustrate this harsh reality.
Yeah, the railway depot.
There was a terrible accident at a railway depot. An engine driver slipped while the train was moving, and he fell directly under the massive iron wheels.
Horrific.
He was crushed and killed instantly. And another driver, reacting on pure raw instinct, reached down to try and pull him out.
And he gets caught, too.
His arm was torn completely off by the machinery. He bled to death shortly after.
2 men gone in seconds. Now, consider the psychological aftermath of that event for the survivors. In 1887, trauma therapy didn't exist.
Not at all.
The railway company wasn't dispatching grief counselors to sit with the surviving workers who had just watched 2 of their friends get mangled to death, nor were they providing psychological support to the newly made widows.
So who walks onto that platform? Who is going to the homes to sit with those shattered families?
It was the London City Mission.
Exactly. They became proto-grief counselors. They were acting as spiritual first responders, essentially absorbing the shock waves of industrial trauma.
But, accessing these working men when tragedy wasn't striking was equally difficult, wasn't it?
Difficult.
Because entering a cabmen's shelter or a railway depot meant stepping into a highly masculine, fiercely competitive intellectual arena. The text specifically notes that 19th century London cabbies were reputedly the keenest men in the world in matters of argument and repartee.
Which makes sense. I mean, think about it. These guys sat on their carriages all day, navigating London traffic, observing human nature, and constantly talking to each other.
They were sharp.
Very sharp. If a missionary walked into that cab rank and showed even an ounce of intellectual weakness, or if he took himself too seriously, they would tear him to shreds.
So how do you survive that?
You use the natural man approach, but you spike it with intense self-deprecation.
Oh, the anecdote in the book about this is absolutely perfect. A missionary named John Galt was assigned to the cabmen.
Yes.
And he tells the story of a temperance preacher, a guy who went around preaching the evils of alcohol, who tried to lecture these working men. And the cabbies and his roommates were apparently just mocking him relentlessly for his simplistic arguments.
Just roasting him.
Roasting him. So the preacher finally turned to them and fired back this brilliant, self-effacing line. He said, All of you must know by this time that I have no more brains than I need for immediate use every hour of the day, and that I couldn't do with any less.
It's a masterclass in diffusion. By completely leaning into the insult and acknowledging his own limitations, he entirely neutralizes their primary weapon against him. He proves he can take a joke.
Which instantly earns him a baseline of respect in that specific culture.
Exactly.
But of course, the mechanized industry that built those railways and those docks was a double-edged sword, because the same industrial capacity that moved coal and passengers was eventually turned toward mass slaughter.
The industrialization of war.
Right. The 19th century industrial boom directly paved the way for the industrialized warfare of the 20th century.
And that brought the global front line right back to the doorsteps and the streets of London.
So let's look at the crucible of the First World War. The LCM's 1915 annual report bluntly states they were fighting a war on two fronts.
And the visuals the book provides here are just devastating. London became the primary receiving ground for refugees fleeing the German invasion of Belgium.
Which is a massive influx.
Massive. Imagine the absolute chaos at the major rail terminuses. Train after train pulling into Victoria Station or Charing Cross, unloading thousands upon thousands of traumatized, destitute men, women, and children.
And they lost everything.
They had lost their homes, their country, and most of them didn't know a single word of English.
But the LCM missionaries were right there on the platforms.
Physically on the platforms, navigating the panic, handing out comfort and tracts printed in Flemish and French.
But it wasn't just civilians they were dealing with, right? The book takes us inside the Wandsworth Hospital as well.
Yes. Wandsworth had been converted to handle the massive influx of casualties coming back from the trenches of the Western Front.
And the scale of the injury was unprecedented.
It was horrifying. There were nearly 2,000 terribly mutilated soldiers there at one point. This included 400 men who had been permanently blinded by shrapnel or mustard gas.
Just awful.
And the missionaries were walking those specific wards daily. One of them actually wrote that they were literally looking into the face of death.
But as psychologically harrowing as World War I was for those dealing with the returning wounded, it was World War II that brought the physical violence directly to the civilian population of London in an entirely unprecedented way.
The Blitz. The Luftwaffe bombing the city into rubble night after night.
Yes, but the book actually focuses on a specific, uniquely terrifying phase of the war that occurred later in the summer of 1944.
Right after the Allies had landed in Normandy.
Exactly. When Londoners thought the worst of the bombings might finally be over, Hitler unleashed his vengeance weapons.
The V1 and V2 rockets.
The technological leap from the Blitz to these rockets was horrifying.
It was a whole new kind of terror. The V1 flying bombs, which were essentially early cruise missiles, flew at 470 miles per hour. And then the V2 rockets were ballistic and supersonic, plunging down from space at 3,600 miles per hour.
Unstoppable, basically.
Completely unstoppable.
Right.
And both carried warheads weighing a full ton.
The psychological terror of the V1 is legendary. Londoners nickname them doodlebugs. The book describes their pulse jet engines sounding like a dying motor car. Just this loud, sputtering cough crossing the sky.
You can hear them coming.
Yes, but the truly agonizing part of the mechanism was that when the bomb ran out of fuel, the engine cut out. The noise stopped.
And then silence.
Everything went dead quiet. And for about 10 to 15 seconds, anyone on the ground just stared at the sky in total silence, waiting for a literal ton of explosives to drop out of the clouds, completely unable to predict where it would hit.
It was acoustic terrorism.
Yeah.
Just brilliant, evil psychology. And the destruction was apocalyptic. The text records that in just 2 weeks, these doodlebugs killed 1,600 Londoners and severely mutilated 4,500 more.
Wow.
Throughout July of 1944, over 20,000 houses were damaged or destroyed every single day.
Every single day. So when a city is enduring 20,000 houses being blown apart every 24 hours, what does a city mission do? It's far too dangerous to be knocking on doors. Do they retreat to the countryside with everyone else?
No, they couldn't.
Why not?
Because their entire DNA, from Naismith onward, was based on physical presence. So they adapted the daily round to the reality of the Blitz. The missionaries essentially integrated their pastoral care directly into the wartime survival mechanisms of the city.
How do they do that?
They took on air raid precaution, or ARP, duties.
Explain the mechanics of that. What is an ARP duty?
It meant walking the blacked-out streets during the air raids. They were enforcing the blackout rules, directing panicked people to the underground shelters, and doing fire watch on rooftops.
While the bombs were dropping.
Yes. They had to be ready to smother incendiary bombs with sandbags before they could burn a neighborhood down. And they did all of this while still trying to offer spiritual comfort to the terrified people around them.
The book also notes they maintained things called thrift and boot clubs during this time, which at first glance seems almost trivial during an active bombing campaign, but it was actually an essential economic anchor for these families.
Far from trivial. During the war, the economy was strictly rationed. A working-class mother couldn't just walk into a store and buy a cheap pair of shoes for a growing child. It required government coupons and cash she likely didn't have.
So what was a boot club?
It was a microfinance mechanism. Mothers would pay a few pennies a week to the missionary, pooling their resources into a savings trust. That way, when winter hit, they had the collected capital to actually buy boots and coal.
So the missionary literally became the banker, the fire watcher, and the pastor all at once.
All at once.
They really became the mortar holding the psychological architecture of the city together. I mean, think about the impact of that. A neighborhood gets decimated by a V-2 rocket on a Tuesday night.
Right.
But on Wednesday morning, the LCM missionary is still there, walking through the rubble, collecting the pennies for the boot club.
Yeah.
It sends a profound subliminal message. The world is ending, but we are still here. There is still a future. You are not abandoned.
That forward-looking resilience is perfectly captured at the very end of the war. The May-June 1945 LCM magazine, they didn't dwell on the trauma they had just survived. As people were literally dancing in the searchlights outside, the magazine ran an article titled, "Out of Uniform Again? My Return to Missionary Work."
They just rolled up their sleeves and looked to the next challenge.
Exactly.
And the next challenge was a massive cultural whiplash because the rubble of London was cleared, the buildings were rebuilt, and the era of the modern metropolis really began.
The city changed again.
The physical cholera was a memory, and the bombs finally stopped falling, but the cultural landscape fractured into thousands of distinct subcultures.
The post-war decades brought entirely new challenges for the mission. The primary focus shifted to the youth, who were growing up in an era of rapid consumerism and shifting moral baselines.
And the book highlights a missionary named Stanley Wilcock, and his story is just a staggering testament to the patience required in this new era.
Truly staggering.
Wilcock was working in the Downham estate, and he focused on a young man named Bill. Wilcock spent 10 years, an entire decade, working with Bill.
He described it as a decade of seed sowing, preparing, and planning. 10 years of conversations, invitations, and setbacks where Bill seemed entirely indifferent or even opposed to the faith.
10 years of getting nowhere, essentially. But the payoff comes in 1954. Billy Graham arrives in London for his crusade at Haringey Stadium.
And to give this context for the listener, this wasn't just a big church service. It was a massive cultural phenomenon. It ran for 6 straight weeks and was the largest religious gathering London had ever seen.
Right. And Wilcock finally convinced Bill to get on a bus and attend one of the massive stadium events.
And that is the exact night Bill finally made a commitment and converted.
Right. But Wilcock's reflection on this is the vital part. He wrote that an outside observer might look at Bill stepping forward in a stadium of thousands and assume the conversion happened instantly.
That it was just driven by the emotion of the crowd and the charisma of the speaker.
Exactly. But Wilcock knew that behind that single moment in 1954 were 10 years of quiet, unglamorous, persistent relationship building. He noted that he had learned to stop worrying about the timeline and simply do his job in the now.
That kind of localized, dogged patience is the absolute antithesis of the mass media, instant gratification culture that was rapidly taking over in the post-war years.
And as the 20th century closed, the spiritual needs mutated again, becoming even more abstract. Let's jump to the 1990s.
The 90s.
The rise of New Age philosophy and extreme spiritual consumerism. The missionaries are no longer just dealing with physical starvation or post-war trauma. They are navigating a culture that is materially wealthy, but spiritually totally adrift.
Right. The book mentions a missionary named Paul James Griffiths, who specifically targeted the markets and side streets where New Age, occult, and alternative spiritual shops were booming.
And the LCM's response was a really fascinating pivot. They didn't stand outside these shops with picket signs shouting at people.
No, the Parson approach still doesn't work.
Instead, in 1998, they opened their own Christian center right in the thick of it, a coffee shop called The Vine in Covent Garden.
Now, Covent Garden is incredibly wealthy. It is packed with high-end boutiques, street performers, tourists, expensive restaurants.
It is worlds away from the muck and filth of 1849, so why invest mission resources there?
Because they correctly diagnosed an entirely different variant of poverty. The aim of the vine was to reach the massive crowds of drifting, seeking young people. The LCM recognized that, as the text states, behind the facade of glamour and affluence are some of the neediest people, spiritually and materially, in our country today.
So they built a space where conversations could just happen naturally over coffee.
The natural man approach updated for the 90s cafe culture.
Exactly. And this adaptability leads to some wonderfully surreal encounters. There's this great detail in the book where a missionary is walking through Hyde Park near the famous Speaker's Corner.
Where everyone is just shouting their ideologies at each other.
Yes. And he spots a group of Hare Krishnas sitting on the grass having a picnic.
Now, the 19th century parson approach would have been to stand 20 feet away and just preach at them.
Tell them they are going to hell. Exactly. But this missionary just walks over, introduces himself, and asks if he can sit down and join their picnic.
And they let him.
They let him. He sits on the grass. He hands them a tract about Christ being the light of the world, which they politely accept. And then he admits in his report that he was entirely at a loss for what to do next.
That's hilarious.
It's a funny, deeply human moment, but it illustrates how incredibly complex and layered the cultural playing field had become.
Which perfectly explains why the very profile of an LCM missionary had to undergo a radical evolution in modern times. The book is very honest in noting that historically, being a city missionary was sometimes condescendingly viewed by the broader church as a second-rate calling.
Right, like something for earnest men who lacked the intellectual rigor to be ordained ministers.
But the 21st century reality completely shatters that stereotype.
Entirely. Today, the LCM recruits what they call reflective practitioners.
Which means what, exactly?
These are highly educated individuals, often holding advanced academic degrees in theology, social work, urban planning, or management. The model of the solitary lone wolf walking the slums has been replaced by sophisticated teams operating out of Christian centers, utilizing a massive diversity of professional talents.
And they absolutely need that level of education and strategic teamwork because they are trying to reach a city that is hyper-diverse.
So diverse.
The text cites a newspaper report for the year 2000, noting that over 300 different languages are spoken by children in London's school system.
300.
It is arguably the most linguistically and culturally fragmented city on Earth.
So if we step back and view this entire timeline from 1835 to the modern day, it raises a profound question.
Okay, what's the question?
I want to pose this directly to you, the listener. Think about the mechanics of human connection. Is it harder to reach a person starving in an 1849 slum who knows with absolute certainty that they are dying and desperately need rescue? Or is it harder to reach a spiritually adrift, materially comfortable person sitting in a 1998 Covent Garden coffee shop who doesn't even realize they are lost?
That is a great question.
Because the architecture changes, the wealth changes, the fashion changes, but the core human isolation remains exactly the same.
Which brings us to the culmination of our deep dive today. The unchanging secret in a changing city.
We have covered a truly massive sweep of history here. We've gone from Asiatic cholera and the brutal poor laws, to Lord Shaftesbury reforming the boarding houses, to missionaries dodging supersonic V-2 rockets, all the way to drinking coffee with Hare Krishnas in Hyde Park.
It's quite the journey.
It is, and yet the authors claim the LCM has maintained a flexible and fruitful stability. In a world that changed that drastically, what is the anchor?
To reveal that anchor, the book offers a deeply moving postscript. It is a letter written in September 2002 by an anonymous passerby who frequently walked past the LCM's Waterloo mission on Weber Street.
I want to look closely at this letter because the psychology of it is so familiar to anyone who lives in a modern city today.
It really is.
The writer describes walking down Weber Street and seeing a down-and-out man lying face down on the concrete. The man is semi-conscious, and his hand is outstretched toward a discarded beer can.
A very common sight, unfortunately.
Right. And the writer honestly notes the typical urban reaction. People are just scurrying past, intentionally averting their eyes, building a psychological wall, and silently deciding this man is not worthy of their sympathy or their time.
It is the tragedy of urban alienation. We train ourselves not to see the suffering right at our feet. We numb ourselves to it.
But then the writer notices a young man walked on the steps of the LCM mission building. The writer naturally assumes this young staff member is coming out to perform a sterile, bureaucratic function.
Like to tell the vagrant to move along.
Get off the mission's property so they don't block the sidewalk.
Right. But he breaks the script.
He entirely shatters the script. The letter reads, Instead, he crouched beside this forlorn figure and stroked his face with tenderness and apparent affection.
Wow.
The passerby admits it was a shameful moment for them. It was a profound rebuke that forced them to realize the pile of rags on the street was a living, breathing human being worthy of touch.
That image, the simple, unhurried, tender stroke on the face of an unconscious, marginalized man on a concrete sidewalk, is the perfect synthesis of the London City Mission's 160-year journey.
It answers the question we started with.
It brings us all the way back to Tim Keller's quote from the foreword.
Right.
The secret to their longevity isn't a complex proprietary theological algorithm. It isn't a massive corporate marketing budget or a brilliant social media strategy. The secret, Keller writes, is simply the same person going to the same people regularly to become their friend for Jesus' sake.
It is stunning in its simplicity. When we started this deep dive, I think we were looking for some grand, sweeping institutional strategy.
Some master plan.
But the through line is just physical, persistent, localized presence. The methodology has never wavered. Whether it's sitting with an engine driver bleeding out on a railway track in 1887.
And we're holding the hand of a blinded Belgian soldier in a hospital ward in 1915.
Or running a boot club in the rubble of 1944. Or crouching next to an unconscious man on Weber Street in 2002. They just physically show up.
And in our modern culture, which absolutely worships novelty, rapid disruption, and digital detachment, that kind of simple, dogged, analog persistence isn't just effective. It is a profoundly radical act of rebellion.
It really is. And as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. We live in an era that is completely obsessed with scaling solutions.
Everything has to scale.
We want to write a piece of code, utilize AI, or leverage mass media to solve our social problems efficiently, cleanly, and globally from a distance.
Without having to touch the mess.
Exactly. But the 160-year success story of the London City Mission suggests something fundamentally different about human nature. It suggests that true, lasting human transformation refuses to be scaled. It cannot be automated or optimized. It only happens one freezing attic, one hospital bed, or one coffee shop table at a time.
And it demands the slow, messy, inefficient, quiet work of just showing up again and again, long after the cameras have left.
So we ask you to look at your own life, your community, or your profession. What is your version of the daily round? Where are you relying on a quick, scalable, technological fix when what is really desperately needed is your slow, persistent, physical presence? The map of human need is just as muddy and complex today as it was in Dickens' London. The question is whether you're willing to step off the pristine pavement and walk into the muddy waters. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Streets Paved with Gold. We warmly encourage you to track down the book, dig into these stories yourself, and keep exploring.